My name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research here. We are really delighted to welcome you to today's talk, which is titled A Letter from Danzig, Understanding Jewish Family Correspondence from the First World War with Dr. Joe Cronin. So as you can tell, this event is organized part of our current exhibition on Holocaust Letters. We have this vibrant exhibition and event series. And if you haven't had a chance, we hope you've had a chance to look at the exhibition. And if you haven't, of course, feel free to stay on after and have a look. The exhibition and events series was co-organized through our Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership activities, which we carry out together with the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. I co-curated this exhibition with Sandra Lipner, who is a doctoral student at Royal Holloway, University of London, and she's joining us online today. Today's talk will pick up some themes that Sandra and I explored in this exhibition. The talk description asks, letters provide insight into their writers, but how much can we learn about them from one letter? This talk examines a Jewish nurse's letter to her brother from the opening months of the First World War. The letter is replete with allusions to the unfolding military situation on the Eastern Front, but it also offers a glimpse into her own journey of self-discovery. A newly trained nurse, a woman who has realized that she, quote, likes working. Dr. Cronin's talk will also focus on the challenges of reading correspondence written in archaic German in a near-indecipherable script, something I think my co-curator and I had a lot of experience of as we put together this exhibition. How much meaning can we truly recover from textual artifacts that were intended for somebody who knew their author far better than we do? So before introducing our speaker, just a few notes of housekeeping. We aren't expecting a fire alarm, but should that happen, please just exit the same entry that you came into the library in. We only have one entry and exit and gather across the street. We will have time for Q&A after Dr. Cronin's talk. He'll be speaking for about 35-40 minutes. And we will have time to take questions in the crowd and also online if you're logging in and joining us virtually. You will be kept on mute throughout the entire program, but please put any questions or comments that you have in the chat. And then if you're asking a question in person, we just ask you to wait for the microphone and to speak into the microphone, and that way people online can hear your question. So now to our speaker. Dr. Joseph Cronin is lecturer in modern German history at Queen Mary University of London. He specializes in modern German, Jewish, and East European history and is currently writing a book about Jews in the Free City of Danzig from 1920 to 1939. So welcome back to the library, Joe.
Thank you so much, Christine, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out here today to see this talk. Yeah, initially I had intended for this talk to be something slightly different to what it has become when I was first asked to deliver the talk by Sandra Lipner, one of the curators of this exhibition. I was in the midst of trying to figure out how family letters fit into my own research on Jewish life in Danzig. I think it's fair to say that private letters, are not such a straightforward primary source to understand, to make sense of, as other kinds of sources, for example, government documents or Jewish community documents. And their value to the historian is perhaps less immediately obvious. So I originally wanted to do a kind of theoretical exploration of letters and how it's difficult to extract meaning from letters. And I was going to use a single example to illustrate this. However, subsequently, there's been some interest from the family of the woman whose letter I've chosen to analyze. So I thought I can't just have it be this kind of abstract theoretical investigation. And I decided to make it more personal, more about the woman who wrote the letter. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about who she was. She was born Rosa Anker in 1887 in Danzig. which at the time was in the German province of West Prussia. She was the second youngest of 12 siblings, 8 of whom survived into adulthood. Her father, you can see him there, was Simon Anker, a successful grain merchant in the city, and her mother was Henrietta Anker, born Henrietta Meyer. So Rosa grew up as part of the educated, assimilated German Jewish middle class. Certainly the family was religiously Jewish, but not strictly Orthodox. And as I'll talk about later, she and her family had a very strong German identity, which was not uncommon for German Jews at this time. So from what I've read about her, Rosa was somebody you might describe as small but fierce. She was about 5 feet tall, I think. She was, by all accounts, a very intelligent woman and a good judge of character. And she was a very good horse rider too, which was perhaps unusual for a woman at that time. Rosa married her husband Sigmar Karplus, a pioneering radiologist in 1924, and moved to Berlin. There they are in 1940. They had 2 children, one of whom I'm really delighted to say is here today, Elsa Shamash, and who has told me some things already just before this talk that have sort of added to my knowledge, so I may have to change some of the things I say now. Something I don't have time to talk about today is the family's convoluted and indeed nail-biting escape from Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, which included attempts to find refuge in countries like Iceland and Ecuador, and the decision to put their 2 children on a Kindertransport in 1939. Suffice it to say that the parents, Rosa and Sigmar, did make it out of Germany just in time and settled in Britain. I think it's worth mentioning at this juncture just how difficult it was to get a visa for Britain if you were a Jewish refugee at this time. And Rosa died in London in 1981 at the age of 93. But back in August 1914, Rosa was 26 years old when war broke out in Europe, and that is where we will pick up her story. So on the left there is a photo of her serving in 1916, which was the same year she was awarded her nursing certificate that you can see on the right. So having said all that, let me touch on some of the theoretical stuff that I wanted to focus on in this talk. One scholar who's written about how to use letters as a historical source is Miriam Dobson. And she argues quite persuasively, in my view, that letters are not a simple reflection of who we really are or what we really think, but rather they are a means through which we can convey who we understand ourselves to be and how we would like ourselves to be perceived by others. Letters are, in other words, part of the process through which we construct our identities. And of course, letters are always intended for a recipient or recipients. And this significantly determines the tone and even the content of a letter. They're not just written into the ether, they're written for somebody. And as we'll see in this case, Rosa was writing to her brother, which determined what she said and how she said it. If she was writing to a friend or a different family member, for example, one of her parents, what she wrote in the letter would naturally be different. So we should understand a letter as being part of a dialogue between, in this case, two people. And in fact, Rosa explicitly acknowledges this in the first lines of this letter when she writes about her other letters getting lost in the post. Nothing ever arrives, she writes. One gradually loses the desire to write. But letters are also more than just texts. Letters are physical artifacts. And I've been privileged actually in working with Leslie Michaels, who's also here today, Rosa's great nephew, who first introduced me to this topic. In working with him on his family history, I've been lucky enough to see many of his family's letters as physical artifacts, as pieces of yellowing paper with fading ink and handwriting in an old German script called Courant. Can't really pronounce it. Anyway, there you have the pages of this letter. I don't know if anyone here can read it. Maybe one person. So you have the level of the artifact, and then you have to extract the text from it. So you have to transcribe it, and that's hard. And then you, in order to present it to an English-speaking audience, you then have to translate it, which takes the text another step away from what was originally written, how it was written, and who it was written by. And I'll say at this juncture that this letter, this particular letter, has actually been transcribed and translated by two individuals, one of whom is here today, and Alice Riedler, and it's her translation that you hold in front of you. And the other is my friend Irene Auerbach, who came to this country as a refugee with her family at a very young age in 1939. And Irene and I looked at this letter together. There you can see us, which at the time, this was a few years ago, was really exciting because it was like this letter was sort of coming alive again after 100-odd years. And that's quite a special thing, actually, if a letter hasn't been read for a very long time. So we have two individuals who've worked on deciphering this text. And when I'm quoting from this letter today, we're actually hearing Alice's words as much as we are Rosa's words. And that, I think, adds a complicating dimension, albeit a pleasant complicating dimension, to our interpretation of this letter. So I hope you'll join me for the next 20 minutes or so as we explore some of its complexities and ambiguities. And we'll try to figure out what Rosa might have meant when she wrote certain things. In doing this interpretation, I'm drawing on the work of two scholars in particular who propose alternative methodologies for the reading of texts. The first is Quentin Skinner, my colleague at Queen Mary, and the other is, Quentin Skinner, I should say, is an expert in how to derive a text's meaning and the intention of the author who wrote it. So he's all about how do you figure out what an author meant when they wrote a text. The other scholar is the French philosopher Roland Barthes, who argued that it is in fact impossible to determine an author's intention from the text they wrote, and that what matters instead is, quote, the social, mental, and institutional conditions of possibility, end quote, of a given text. And I think I kind of fall somewhere in between these two poles. So, as I said, letters are part of a dialogue between two people, but they're also more than that. They're part of a broader, what we call discourse. Discourse is the way in which a language operates at a particular in a particular cultural context at a particular point in time. So time and place. It will contain certain linguistic conventions and codes that might not be clear to someone from a different cultural context. So in order to understand this letter, we need to understand German discourse, German-speaking culture at the time the letter was written. And when was the letter written? On the 27th of October, 1914. Now, the autumn of 1914 was a significant moment in German culture. It was the opening stage of the First World War. So what factors were determining German discourse at this time? Already, the German plan for how they would fight the war had gone catastrophically wrong. Even before the conflict started, Germany knew it was going to have to fight France to its west and Russia to its east. But it wanted to avoid a two-pronged war, which would have meant splitting its army. So Germany's plan was to invade France first through Belgium and knock it out of the war quickly so that it could focus its entire war effort on Russia. Now, this plan, which was called the Schlieffen Plan after the general who devised it, had been predicated on the belief that Russia, which is a huge country, would take at least 6 weeks to mobilize its army. But in fact, Russia's army mobilized much quicker than expected and headed west to the border with Prussia. Germany, therefore, had to scramble an army together and send them east, thus producing the two-front war that they had always feared. So you can't really see this map at all, I've just realized, but it's a really great map. What I would like to draw your attention to is the town of Gumbinnen, up near the top right-hand corner, but this is basically East Prussia, the autumn of 1914. So this is where Rosa's letter comes in. The German and the Russian forces met near the town of Gumbinnen on the 20th of August, and the Germans, being underprepared and over-hasty, were beaten by the Russian forces. Now, this was an early blow to German hopes that they would win the war quickly. There's a nice photo there that I found showing the German generals before the Battle of Gumbinnen. When I was initially preparing this paper, I made an interpretive error, and I assumed that because something happened in reality, i.e. the Germans were beaten, because something happened in reality, I assumed people would know about it. I assumed people in Germany would know about it. People would have known that Germany was beaten at the Battle of Gumbinnen. That wasn't the case when I looked into it further. When I checked German newspaper headlines for the days following the battle, this is what I saw. Deutscher Sieg bei Gumbinnen, German victory at Gumbinnen, victory in the west, the Russian offensive held off at Gumbinnen. There's some more as well. The Russians defeated at Gumbinnen. 8,000 Russians taken as prisoners of war at Gumbinnen. This is just a sample. There's absolutely no mention of a defeat anywhere in these German newspapers, only talk of a victory. So this was not an episode that found its way into German national discourse in the way that you might expect. Rosa, however, had seen the consequences of this battle firsthand and was much more open and honest about its negative aspects. She even says openly in the letter, our troops had been beaten at Gumbinnen. So that leads me to my next point, which is whether this letter was censored. And it seems highly unlikely that it was, both because of what she says about Gumbinnen, but also because official censorship of German letters in the First World War was only introduced in 1916, applying first to soldiers' letters before it was extended to civilian letters in 1917. However, this does not exclude the possibility that the content of Rosa's letter was informed by the cultural expectations surrounding the war. For example, Rosa uses the word honor on 2 occasions when describing how the German soldiers backed out honorably, she says, after the defeat at Gumbinnen, and secondly, when she implores her brother Georg to return safe and sound with honor. Now you might just say this is the word that Rosa chooses to use in this letter, but is it that simple? Is there perhaps a social dimension to her use of the word honor? Now, when I ran the word ehrenvoll, full of honor, through Google's Ngram viewer, this is a favorite hobby of mine at the moment, through Google's Ngram viewer, which shows the incidence in the use of a word through time, based on a database of millions of texts. You can see a spike there in the years of the First World War. So I would say that to some degree, Rosa is conforming to social convention in her use of the word honor in this letter. Now, to many people in this audience, my next point will be quite obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Rosa and Rosa's family were, at this point, staunch German patriots. I think it's important from a historical perspective to acknowledge that. Yes, they were Jewish, but as I mentioned earlier, the family was highly assimilated and involved with many German cultural associations in Danzig. And it's without question that Rosa would have supported the German armed forces for whom she was serving and would have wanted them to win the war. So I've talked about the letter as a physical artifact, but it is also, of course, a text, which you're holding before you. Once you get past the paper and the ink and the handwriting, and you've transcribed it into Latin script and you've translated it into English, then you've got a text that you can read on a screen or on the printed page. So what is that text, and how can you find out what was meant by the person who wrote that text? First of all, a text doesn't, and indeed can't, fully capture what happened in reality. People filter their experiences of reality through the medium of writing, and that produces a text. Text is a way of recording language, and language is an imperfect representation of reality, rather like a pixelated photograph, or I quite like this painting by Paul Klee. So that's one level. That writing doesn't represent reality very, maybe not accurately, but doesn't represent it perfectly. But a letter that you wrote yesterday would contain those problems. You know, no letter kind of represents reality perfectly. But with this letter, there's also a temporal aspect which also affects the transference of meaning. This letter was written almost 109 years ago. And the meaning of words and phrases changes over time. What this means in practical terms is that there's all sorts of things that could be missed or misinterpreted by someone who only has an understanding of contemporary German. And indeed, there were certain expressions in this letter that totally threw me before I read Alice's translation. So, for example, we have the phrase bunter Rock, which literally means colorful skirt, wie in den bunten Rock gesteckt wurde, in the original. But what this actually means in context is, as you can see on your translation, uniform or military uniform. And to make things even more complicated, there are also a handful of words and phrases in this letter that weren't even part of mainstream German discourse at this time. Rather, they can be considered part of a German sub-discourse, one that was used by German Jews. As examples of this, you have a word that's used twice in this letter, schmooze. So I regret that my daily cards have not arrived. This is wirklich kein leerer Schmus. And could talk with him for hours, konnte stundenlang schmusen. Its English equivalent, one that you'll recognize, is schmooze. Yeah. But you wouldn't translate it as that. You would never say, it is really not empty schmooze in English. So it can really only be translated as words or talk or something like that, small talk. But none of this quite captures what Rosa meant when she used the word schmooze. A more obvious example is when Rosa refers to Erev Rosh Hashanah, Jewish religious holiday. And this would have contextualized these events that she's describing to her brother more clearly than if she had said, you know, the 19th of September, which is a forgettable date. So it's things like this that you have to be aware of when you're interpreting a letter, and some of them can trip you up. You can't assume that you are going to be able to understand the content of a letter like this self-evidently. And to some degree, you're always reading these historical letters through a glass darkly. Okay, so for the final part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some more aspects of the letter itself. One noteworthy theme, which I pointed out in the blurb, is gender. Of course, the letter is written by a woman, but I think she's also at a particular point in her life. She is at a point of self-discovery. She says very clearly in the letter that she is enjoying working. She's enjoying being a nurse. Now, I initially assumed from this comment that Rosa had had no previous work experience, but it transpired that she had, in fact. Here we can see her teaching certificates from 1909. I was talking to Elsa Karpus just before the talk, who said that she did qualify as a teacher, but never really taught. So that's another complicating dimension. She did get a teaching certificate. This was one of the few professions that women were able to get a university education for at the time. So when Rosa refers to enjoying working, this is probably the first time working as a nurse that she's really been, if you like, on the front line, almost literally. And of course, that kind of work entails, well, it's physical, it's quite grueling being a war nurse. And she goes into that in some detail in her letter. It also seems fair to assume that being a nurse isn't a job that she would have chosen to do in peacetime. Presumably, she would either pursued being a teacher or maybe nothing. She has been prompted into nursing due to the war and the expectation that every German does their duty. But nonetheless, she's finding it to be a fulfilling activity. And I think her attitude here is in line with broader social and cultural developments in Europe at this time, as millions of women from the belligerent nations began to work for the first time on the home front. And of course, that has profound consequences for the position of women in these societies, maybe not immediately, but over subsequent decades. Women are beginning to realize their potential through these kinds of roles in national service. Another interesting feature of the letter is the reference to General von Rochem, or Wrochem. He was a real person. His name was Hans von Wrochem. You can see his Wikipedia page there, only in German. And he had a colorful and varied military career. As a young man, he fought in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And later on, he served in German colonial East Africa, and he even volunteers for China during the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion in 1901. Anyway, at the start of the First World War, he's billeted with the Anker family, who have 4 sons serving in the army. The family presumably already know von Wrochem, although it's not clear how from the letter. Either way, getting billeted with a senior general wasn't the sort of treatment that most German families got. But the most astonishing thing about von Wrochem in this letter is the very casual, matter-of-fact way in which Rosa announces that he has died infolge von Erkältung, as a result of a cold, as she puts it. Now, later on, she does say that she had to lie down to recover from the shock after hearing this news. So it's not that she's unfeeling, but the way that she chooses to relay this news to her brother, Georg, is a bit of a mystery to me. I wonder if it might have something to do with Georg's likely response. And there's also the question of why Georg presumably still doesn't know about von Wrochem's death over 2 months after it had taken place. Sorry, over 1 month after it had taken place. And even though 3 of his brothers had been billeted with von Wrochem. Here are the brothers, by the way, a bit later on with their father in Sopot, a seaside resort near Danzig. You can tell they're brothers, can't you? Okay. Coming towards the end now, there's just one final feature that I wanted to comment on in the letter, and it struck me as rather cryptic, and maybe this is just me reading too much into it. But it appears in the letter after Rosa describes returning from her barge journey with a tan. She says, everyone was happy on our barge. It was wonderful when the weather was good. I came home in the evening with a tan, just like from our beautiful tour. In Königsberg, someone wanted to know from which distant country I had come to nurse the sick in Germany. Now, why would somebody say that? Is it because she has a tan? Or is there something else going on here? As I say, I don't know the answer, and probably we will never know the answer, but it did stick out to me when I read this letter. Okay, so to conclude, how should a historian use a letter such as this in their research? As I hope I've established, letters are not a repository of factual information. They do not even necessarily provide us with an insight into the true thoughts or feelings of the people who wrote them. So what can letters tell us? I would suggest that they tell us a cluster of interrelated things. Firstly, letters are a means through which people construct their identities, both to themselves and to the person or people to whom they are writing. Secondly, letters exist in a dialogue with others, and so this identity construction is negotiated. It is mediated by the expectations of others, expectations which people may not even consciously realize they are living up to. The others, in this case, may be the people, for example, family or friends to whom the person is writing, but it also includes the broader society and the conventions and expectations of that society, which the letter writer may conform to or rebel against. Now, as I said earlier, you could learn all of those things from a letter that someone wrote yesterday. Reading a letter from the past is a more challenging enterprise, but potentially also a more rewarding one. Because if we do it well, if we can figure out what kinds of expectations and conventions the letter writer was responding to, then we will learn more about a society that no longer exists. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
I had to turn the button on. Yeah, good. So thank you. That was really fantastic, in part because you asked so many of the same or similar kinds of questions that Sandra and I were thinking about and discussing as we curated this exhibition. And it shows that the themes of the exhibition, of course, transcend temporally beyond the Second World War. And yours is more focused on the first, but obviously very resonant with what we were thinking about and discussing. So if there are any questions in the room, I'm happy to take those now. Questions or comments? The other aspect I thought that was really interesting was reading the letters alongside family members and the different perspectives that you drew on there. So I don't know if perhaps you'd like to say a bit more about that while people gather their thoughts for a question. Any kind of new insights you drew from your discussions, either before the talk or...
Well, yes. I think I was trying to ascertain what Rosa's career had looked like before the First World War. And initially, just from reading the letter, I thought, oh, well, this was clearly her first working role. But then Leslie showed me that she'd actually got a teaching certificate in 1909. So I thought, okay, she'd be a teacher. But then just from speaking to Elsa now, she said, well, actually, that was a kind of a... she read. Yeah, that was so yeah, I mean, there's all of these kinds of details that actually I didn't know, and I hope someone's writing them down because these are things that you can't even from a whole repository of letters you can't get the full picture. And I think everyone can interpret the letter differently for sure, but then also some people know things from Rosa's life who knew her, who were able to sort of fill in some of those gaps and add more information, which helps us to understand the letter better as well.
Any questions? Leslie, and then...
Hi, Leslie. Just wanted to add something on General von Brochen. who was the senior Prussian general in the area. And I suspect that he was billeted there with Simon Anker and his wife Henrietta because they had the largest house in Danzig, I think the largest domestic house. They had a big house where there were 3 families living in that house. And 4 of their sons were in the fighting in the German army. And I think von Brocken, and it comes through in this letter, which you don't actually quote this bit of it, that he reassured Henrietta that the children, that her 4 sons would be safe, and that the victory would be coming soon.
Yes, I think that is his function, actually. So I think it's a combination. I mean, I'm sure there were other, German families who had lots of sons serving, but I think that combined with the fact that the Ankers are a prominent family, probably swung it that they could have this senior general sort of watching the taking care, taking the sons under his wing, I suppose. And it's I suppose maybe worth saying that that's a question, that they all survive, all 4 of the sons survive, which is quite remarkable as well, actually, in the context of the First World War.
When you talk about the language, of course, a lot of it is East Prussian.
Yes.
And they're very, very conscious of their Danzig dialect, which of course you get in Güntergrass. And so it's, and I think they were not so much conscious of being German as of being East Prussian.
Right.
And my mother on her marriage certificate gives her nationality as Prussian. She doesn't say, perhaps she didn't know whether to say Danzig or German, and it says Prussian.
That's fascinating.
And they often talk just of East Prussia.
Because Germany.
I mean, Germany after only existed 40
years.
So,
wow.
They were still very, very regional.
I didn't talk about that actually, but of course, it's not just a German discourse; it's a regional East Prussian.
A lot of the expressions are Danzig.
Thank you. That's amazing. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Juliet. I'm just interested in why you're writing a book, is it, about the Jews of Danzig? I mean, were they unique in any way? What was it that attracted you to that topic?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I suppose every Jewish community, German Jewish community, is unique to a degree, but then things become very, very different once you hit the end of the First World War. Danzig is taken away from Germany and becomes a free city. So all the citizens there have their own Danzig passports, and there's a Danzig currency and so forth. And then even more different in 1933 when the city elects a Nazi government, which doesn't even happen in Germany. I mean, it sort of outright elects a Nazi government. And then the Jewish community is, of course, in a very precarious position. But the Nazi government, because it's not Germany, they can't sort of act with impunity. They are constrained by the constitution of the Free City, which is backed up by the League of Nations. So it's this very progressive constitution that says you can't discriminate against anyone based on religion and so forth. And so it's becomes this very complicated, almost like a game of chess that the Nazis are playing to disenfranchise the Jews, but they can't really pass any laws to do so. They're using different means. And the ways in which the Jewish community responds to that as well is very interesting. And ultimately they are able to save most of the Danzig Jews through striking a deal with the government. So that's kind of what I'll be mostly focusing on, but the prehistory is also fascinating. Yes.
And of course, Danzig had been Polish at times before the partition of Poland during the Napoleonic 18th century. Frederick the Great, etc. That 1640, 1700, the partition, it varied, and half the population was always sort of Poland. So situation was different because it had this Polish
Yeah.
population
Yeah.
as well as the German population.
Yes, and the
And
Jewish.
they kept separate, the same as the Polish Jews. And the
Yes,
German
yeah.
Jews kept separate on
Yes,
the whole.
it is. It is quite a
Your mother
heterogeneous.
was the only one who went between who had Polish Jews. And she used to talk about that.
Yeah, there were some tensions, weren't there? But then I think when the Nazis came to power, those tensions were overcome as they realized that they're kind of in the same situation, you know, in response to this this government. Yeah.
I'm going to just take one question from online and then I'll come back to you, Charlie. So question from Sandra Lipner, as asking, saying, thank you so much for such an insightful close reading of a letter. I'm wondering if Rosa commented on the question about her country of origin in the next sentence. Can you work out anything about the meaning of that comment from this or from another one of Rosa's letters?
In the country of origin.
Not sure if it's this, it mustn't be this slide.
This quote?
Or maybe this, it must be the slide, yeah.
What did she say in the next sentence? I don't think she does. I recall not being sure of what the context of this comment was. Königsberg. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So that's the geographical reference. But so she is in East Prussia still, but someone has clearly mistaken her as not being from Germany. Maybe it's the East, I would say maybe it's the East Prussian accent. But I presume this person would have been familiar with that accent if they're in Königsberg. So it just struck me as an unusual line. And I mean, sometimes confusion isn't a bad state to be in with something like this, where there's lots of interesting possibilities. We'll probably never know, but I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about this.
Charlie.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's interesting to hear how much context you can gain from one item, I suppose. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask. Where does this letter sit in the context of a broader collection, or is it entirely isolated? Is this presentation more like an exercise in how to find from one particular source, or is it used in a whole set of letters between these two? And if that's the case, then what drew about this letter specifically, or is it not? Is that kind of the point, right? That you could do this for every single letter in terms of drawing out different aspects of context, different aspects of where it comes from.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, you certainly could do it for any letter, and you could go into immense amounts of detail. I think this is a particularly interesting letter. But one of the kind of inspirations for this talk was talking to my students who, working on their dissertations and saying, well, how many primary sources do I have to use? And I'm saying, well, it's about quality rather than quantity. And then I thought, well, can I do a whole talk about one source and try, and maybe it's why, maybe it hasn't, but just try and unpack as many things out of it. So that's one thing. And then the broader collection is in the possession of various family members. Leslie is one of them. And it's not completely diffuse. I mean, there is some coherence to it. There's particular people who write lots of letters, and a lot of it has been preserved. There's more letters from Rosa at different points in time. But they are kind of more like snapshots rather than long streams of correspondence. You often don't get the letter that's in reply, and the next time you hear from this person is a few years later, or even like a couple of decades later sometimes. So you are getting building an impression of them over their lifetime, but you kind of, you zoom in on these moments. And I think that I just thought this was a particularly interesting moment, both in her life, but also in terms of the broader situation that she's describing at the start of the First World War.
Sorry, I got another one. I was going to ask also about the translation aspect. So all of the letters that I use in my research are translated because I can't speak German. So
Yeah.
I have to rely on them, right? I was wondering what difference that makes in terms of the analysis make, and also if you translated them, right? So how did you choose the particular phrasings or the particular ways of doing it, or because you can come up with sort of many different ways of saying the same thing, right? And then how truthful is that then to the original which you have? So
Yeah.
that would be an interesting question for both of you.
Alice, do you want to go first?
It's obviously very hard, but I too had, the privilege of working on many, many letters of the family. And I guess the more you do, the more you get used to their words, the way they write, what they want to say. But of course, and I always think like the biggest job with this is deciphering the letter first, which takes, in this case, it took really long because it's like 4 pages. And once you've done that, putting it into English is almost, it's an afterthought, but also, you read German.
Yeah, yeah.
But now seeing it like this, I thought, that's a word I chose. And yeah, it's, I understand now it's a big responsibility, but yeah.
I wonder if you've done a few letters by one person, do you start to kind of hear a voice?
Yeah, you do.
Do you start to hear their voice? Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes it easier because, like you said, the more you know about the person, the family members, the names, the situation, the easier it gets, and the easier the translation flows somehow. I guess if it was one letter, it would be really hard to make out the names in the first place and the whole context.
Yeah.
But then it becomes like that name, even von Brochem, it took a while to figure out who it was. But then once you get all the pieces, it's easier.
I mean, it is, I find translation super interesting because of course, everybody will translate it differently. And I could have given you Irene Auerbach's translation, which is quite different in some respects as well. Leslie.
In this particular sentence, Irene Auerbach translated, or has actually transcribed in Königsberg, sprache man mich an, which would seem to say that in Königsberg, people said, or more than one person might have said. So, no, sprache man an, it might be just one person. Someone said, okay.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think we can never really. I mean, the translation just kind of blurs it a bit further, I suppose, inevitably, and then even in the German, it's difficult to know exactly what's meant.
Just I wonder what their attitude, this person's attitude, did it represent more than one person, and did this person have an attitude towards a foreign person coming to know? What would their reason to ask? What were they feeling and ambivalent about it? On one hand, you're helping, but on the other hand, you're a foreigner.
Yeah.
What would
that's
be about?
That's the interesting thing. And of course, Rosa doesn't go into any further detail, but she was a sharp person. So I think if she felt that it was sort of aggressively directed against her, she might have said that.
Well, maybe she was implying it.
Or maybe she was implying, maybe her brother would have understood that.
Yeah.
That's the other thing.
People were tribal in some way.
So I don't, when I read this, I thought they were complimenting her actually on being tanned.
Oh.
So I had a completely, now that you mention it, obviously it could be 2 ways, but I thought.
It's a sort of a,
yeah.
And then we all interpret the letter differently as well. So it's just endless kind of variations. Yeah.
Really terrific discussion. Any other questions? We're just about out of time. So just leaves it to me to thank you so much for having this talk and for bringing this letter to our attention, and for, of course, for everybody who's attended and also added their perspectives and rich information to this session. So thank you very much. And thank you especially for doing this, Joe. Very good. Thank you. And of course, if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition, please feel free to stay on. We're here open till 5, and please feel free to have a look around. Thank you again.